Rick returned to the Smith house in the quiet hours before dawn. Not through the front door, but through the garage, where the concrete still bore faint scorch marks from projects that had never been properly cleaned up. The house was asleep in the way only suburban homes could be, insulated from the cosmic noise Rick carried with him. He smelled like stale alcohol and ionized air, his coat heavier than when he had left, pockets burdened with devices whose purposes even he had not fully decided on yet. He moved without urgency, because urgency implied expectation. And Rick no longer expected anything from the universe except repetition. The garage lights flickered on at his presence, reacting to biometric signatures they had been trained to recognize and mistrust. Rick ignored them and crossed to his workbench, pushing aside half-assembled machines and empty flasks. Somewhere in the multiverse, an entire civilization had collapsed a few hours earlier due to a miscalculation he had chosen not to correct. Somewhere else, a version of himself had probably made the opposite choice and felt equally empty about it. The symmetry amused him in a distant academic way. He activated a holographic interface and reviewed data streams that had been running in his absence. Portal travel fluctuations, Citadel broadcasts archived and filtered, Morty's stress markers from the tracking implant Rick pretended was no longer active. Everything was within acceptable variance, which meant nothing interesting had happened while he was gone. That, too, felt like a failure. Inside the house, Morty shifted in his sleep. Dreams shaped by half-remembered horrors and school assignments that felt just as threatening. Rick glanced at the monitor showing Morty's vitals and lingered there longer than he would ever admit. The numbers spiked occasionally, residual anxiety from experiences no teenager should have cataloged. Rick told himself it was unavoidable. He always did. Beth's room showed no unusual activity. She had fallen asleep on her side of the bed, with a tablet still glowing faintly beside her. A paused article about equine surgical techniques suspended mid-scroll. Jerry was asleep next to her, breathing unevenly, his dreams likely populated by minor humiliations and imaginary victories. Rick dismissed the feed with a flick of his wrist, irritation bubbling up without a clear target. He poured himself a drink without measuring and leaned back against the bench, eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling. The garage was a constant across universes, even when everything else shifted. He had built it that way on purpose, anchoring himself to something repeatable. A joke, maybe, or a concession. Hard to tell anymore. The problem had been nagging at him for weeks or years, depending on how one measured time after abandoning linear commitment. The Central Finite Curve had been breached. Not catastrophically, not in a way that would immediately collapse reality into something unmanageable, but enough to remind Rick that the wall he had built around infinity was not immutable. Evil Morty's absence still echoed louder than any presence. Rick hated that the kid had won without sticking around to gloat. It suggested a confidence Rick found deeply offensive. Rick drained the glass and set it down too hard, the sound cracking through the quiet garage. He turned back to the interface and began recalibrating sensors, adjusting for variables that only existed outside the curve. Universes where intelligence did not cluster around versions of himself. Places where Rick Sanchez was not special, not dominant, not even relevant. He told himself the work was purely preventative. He told himself a lot of things. Hours passed without notice. The sky lightened outside, morning creeping in with its mundane insistence. Rick's hands moved automatically, soldering, typing, discarding ideas halfway through execution. He paused when a particular data pattern repeated itself, faint but consistent. A signal originating from beyond known probability clusters, brushing against the edge of the curve like a fingertip testing glass. Rick stared at it longer than necessary. Curiosity was dangerous. Curiosity was how this all started. He should have shut it down, logged it as noise, gone inside and pretended to care about breakfast. Instead, he isolated the signal and began tracing its origin, bypassing safeguards he himself had installed. The universe responded the way it always did when Rick pushed too hard, with resistance that felt personal. By the time Morty came downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes and dreading another school day that felt laughably small compared to what he had seen in other dimensions, Rick was already gone again. The garage smelled sharper than usual, the air disturbed. Morty lingered at the doorway, a familiar unease settling in his chest. There were signs he had learned to recognize. Incomplete equations. On the board, a half-melted portal stabilizer, a drink left unminished. Rick had left in a hurry, which meant trouble had invited itself. Morty went to the kitchen instead, where Beth was already awake, coffee in hand, eyes tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She noticed Rick's absence immediately, though she pretended not to. Experience had taught her that acknowledging it too directly only made the waiting worse. Jerry joined them shortly after, overly cheerful and underprepared for the day. He talked about a potential job opportunity that sounded suspiciously like every other one he had mentioned in the past year. Morty nodded where appropriate, his thoughts drifting back to the garage. Beth watched him with concern she masked as casual interest. None of them mentioned Rick, as if saying his name might summon him back in pieces. Elsewhere, Rick emerged into a universe that felt wrong the moment he arrived. The sky was the wrong color, not in any dramatic sense, but in a way that suggested someone had adjusted saturation without understanding why it mattered. Gravity held, physics complied, but the background radiation hummed at a frequency that irritated Rick's teeth. He adjusted his equipment and scanned the area, already annoyed at himself for coming. The signal was stronger here, embedded in the structure of the universe rather than broadcast from any single point. It reminded Rick uncomfortably of himself, of the way his influence tended to warp reality around him. He followed it through a city that looked prosperous in a generic, algorithm-approved way. People moved with purpose. Technology integrated seamlessly into daily life. Too seamlessly. Rick despised elegance when it came without visible cost. He accessed local data streams and learned quickly what unsettled him. This universe had solved problems he considered unsolvable without sacrificing something fundamental. Energy scarcity, disease, even aging had been mitigated through collaborative intelligence rather than singular dominance. No Ricks at the top, no citadel, just a distributed network of minds operating without hierarchy. Rick felt something twist in his chest that he immediately misidentified as indigestion. He moved through the city unnoticed, his presence beneath the threshold of concern. That, more than anything, felt like an insult. He hacked into the central knowledge repository, and skim decades of progress in minutes. The math was sound. The philosophy was infuriating. They had chosen cooperation over control and had not collapsed into chaos as a result. The signal originated from a structure at the heart of the city, a building that looked more like a community center than a seat of power. Rick hesitated before entering, a rare pause that had nothing to do with caution. He told himself it was strategic. He was lying. Inside, the architecture opened up, light and space arranged to encourage transparency. Rick bristled at the implication. He interfaced with the system directly, bypassing physical constraints, and finally located the source. It was not a weapon or a machine, not exactly. It was a framework, an ongoing experiment designed to reach beyond its own universe without imposing itself on others. A way out that did not involve domination. Rick laughed, the sound harsh and inappropriate in the quiet space. Of course someone had figured out how to do it without him. Of course it worked. He could destroy it. The option presented itself immediately, along with a dozen elegant methods. He could collapse the system, introduce paradox, remind this universe of its fragility. That yada was the old instinct, the one that had kept him on top of the curve for so long. Instead, he copied the data. Back in the garage hours later, Rick stared at the projection of the framework, its complexity unfolding like a challenge issued by someone who did not know his name. Morty watched from the stairs, having returned early from school after a fire drill that felt trivial compared to the tension in the air at home. Rick did not acknowledge him, but he adjusted the projection so it would be visible from the doorway. Morty did not understand most of it. He understood enough to know it mattered. Beth appeared behind him, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She recognized that look on Rick's face, the one that meant he had encountered something that threatened his self-image. Jerry hovered in the background, uncertain whether this was a moment to assert himself or stay invisible. Rick shut the projection down abruptly and turned away, already dismantling parts of a device he had not finished building yet. He told himself the data was irrelevant, a curiosity at best. He told himself that universes like that were statistical anomalies, unsustainable in the long run. He told himself that he was still the smartest being that mattered. The garage settled back into its usual chaos, the extraordinary tucked away behind clutter and denial. Rick poured another drink and stared at nothing, the copied framework running quietly in a hidden partition of his mind. Outside, the day continued, indifferent as ever. The multiverse remained infinite, messy, and full of versions of Rick Sanchez who had made different choices. For the first time in a long while, Rick wondered, not for long, not deeply, but enough. Whether intelligence measured by dominance was the smallest possible definition he could have chosen. Rick did not sleep. He told himself he rarely did anymore. But this was different. The garage lights stayed dimmed while the rest of the house cycled through night and early morning again, and he remained seated at the workbench with his coat still on, fingers twitching occasionally, as if they were continuing work that no longer required physical movement. The framework he had copied refused to leave him alone. Not because it was unfinished or unstable, but because it was complete in a way that mocked him. It existed without needing him. He ran simulations in his head while the actual processor sat idle. That alone irritated him. He had always trusted machines more than intuition, Yet now he avoided powering anything up, as though doing so might force him to acknowledge what he already knew. The system from that universe did not depend on a single genius, nor did it orbit one. It was resilient precisely because no individual could dominate it. Rick had built empires on the opposite assumption. The garage door creaked open behind him hours later, pulled upward with hesitant effort. Morty stepped inside, backpack slung over one shoulder, his posture already weighted by the day. He paused when he saw Rick still there, unchanged from the night before. The air felt dense, charged with the residue of something unspoken. Morty lingered near the threshold, uncertain whether to leave or stay, instinctively aware that whatever Rick was doing had consequences that might spill outward. Rick registered his presence without turning around. He felt the familiar pull to dismiss, to deflect, to redirect attention elsewhere. Instead, he remained still, as if acknowledging Morty might anchor him to a conversation he did not want to have. The projection stayed dark, hidden, but the data hummed quietly in secured partitions, layers deep. Morty moved closer, drawn by curiosity and concern in equal measure. He noticed details that felt wrong even to him: the absence of chaos, the lack of half-finished explosions, the strange stillness of Rick's workspace. This was not the aftermath of reckless experimentation. It was the pause before a decision. Beth arrived shortly after, coffee already gone cold in her hand. She took in the scene with a practiced eye, noting Rick's rigidity, Morty's unease, the untouched tools. She had learned to read the signs over years of living adjacent to genius and destruction. This was not a crisis yet. This was incubation. Jerry hovered at the kitchen entrance, drawn in by silence rather than noise. Silence made him nervous. He stayed where he was, pretending to check his phone, acutely aware that no one needed him here, and that asserting himself would only underline that fact. Rick finally moved, standing abruptly and reaching for a component he did not need. The motion broke the tension without resolving it. He busied himself with dismantling a device that had never been activated, reducing it to parts with unnecessary force. The act was destructive but controlled, a familiar compromise. The framework remained untouched. Later, when the house emptied again, and Morty returned to school with lingering glances over his shoulder, Rick sealed the garage and activated full isolation protocols. The lights brightened, systems came online, and the hum of computation filled the space. He pulled the data from its hiding place and let it unfold fully for the first time. The architecture was elegant in a way that offended him, not because it was simple, but because it was humble. The system assumed failure as a baseline and adapted accordingly. It treated intelligence as a distributed property rather than a fixed hierarchy. Rick traced its evolution backward, following branching decisions made not by individuals, but by consensus mechanisms refined over generations. There was no moment of singular brilliance, no flashpoint where one mind bent reality to its will. Progress had been incremental, collective, and persistent. Rick scoffed reflexively, but the sound lacked conviction. He tested the framework aggressively, introducing variables designed to break it. He simulated adversarial conditions, injected entropy, modeled worst-case scenarios. Each time, the system degraded gracefully, rerouting around damage, incorporating loss without collapsing. It did not resist control because it had never been designed to be controlled. Rick felt a familiar irritation give way to something sharper. This was not inferiority in the traditional sense. He could still outthink any individual contributor to the system. But that was irrelevant. The system did not care about individual brilliance. It thrived on redundancy, on shared burden, on a kind of trust Rick had spent his life dismantling. He shut the simulation down before it could finish stabilizing. Watching it succeed felt unbearable. Days passed in uneven fragments. Rick disappeared intermittently, leaving behind half explanations and the smell of ozone. Morty grew increasingly distracted at school, his attention drifting during lectures, his anxiety sharpening without a clear cause. Beth watched Rick more closely now, noticing how his drinking patterns shifted, how his insults lost some of their edge and gained a new, distracted quality. Jerry mistook the change for improvement and allowed himself cautious optimism. One evening, Rick returned from a short trip with unfamiliar equipment, components sourced from universes with incompatible physical constants. He integrated them without hesitation, adapting them on the fly. The project he was building resembled nothing familiar, a hybrid of portal technology and signal dampening arrays. He told himself it was defensive. He told himself he was shoring up weaknesses exposed by the breach in the curve. The truth was messier. He activated the device late at night, when the house was quiet and expectations were low. The air shimmered briefly, then settled. No portal opened. No alarms sounded. Instead, the universe itself seemed to lean closer, as though listening. Rick monitored the readings carefully. The device did not impose structure. It did not filter reality. It created a channel, subtle and non-invasive, allowing information to pass without asserting dominance. It was an imitation of the framework, stripped down and adapted to his own understanding. A compromise between control and surrender. The signal returned almost immediately. Rick froze, hand hovering over the kill switch. This time, the signal carried more detail, more intent. It was not a threat. It was not a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. Somewhere beyond the curve, the system had noticed him. Rick felt a surge of anger disproportionate to the situation. He shut the device down hard, severing the connection before it could deepen. The garage lights flickered as systems recalibrated. Rick stood there, breathing harder than necessary, aware that he had just done something irreversible. He had made himself visible in a way he had avoided for decades. The next morning, Morty confronted him in the garage without fully understanding why. Rick deflected as usual, burying concern under sarcasm and misdirection, but Morty lingered, refusing to be dismissed by tone alone. There was something different about Rick's movements now, a hesitation that had never been there before. Morty sensed it instinctively, the way prey senses a shift in the environment before danger fully manifests. Beth watched the exchange from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She recognized the pattern too. Rick was on the edge of something transformative or catastrophic. Those were often the same thing. Rick left again that afternoon, this time without equipment or explanation. He traveled light, moving through familiar coordinates with practiced ease, but his destination was not one he had visited before. He aimed beyond the curve, trusting the faint imprint left by the brief connection. The universe resisted at first, reality buckling under the strain of his passage. But Rick forced his way through with brute calculation and stubborn refusal to fail. He emerged into a void that was not empty. Structures floated in relative proximity, not tethered to any single universe, but existing in the spaces between. They were not fortresses or laboratories, but hubs of exchange, nodes in a network that spanned realities without conquering them. Rick scanned the area, every instinct screaming at him to arm himself, to assert control, to prepare for betrayal. Nothing attacked him. Instead, data flowed around him, patterns adjusting to his presence without prioritizing it. The network acknowledged him the way it acknowledged everything else, as a variable, not a master. Rick drifted closer, rage and fascination colliding. He accessed the nearest node cautiously, bracing for resistance. The system responded by opening pathways, offering information freely without demand. It had no concept of ownership in the way Rick understood it. Knowledge was not hoarded. It was shared, iterated, refined. Rick felt something crack then, deep and unpleasant. Not his confidence, but the narrative he had built around it. He had always believed that the universe rewarded those strong enough to take what they wanted. This system suggested a different truth, that the universe also tolerated those who refused to dominate it. He withdrew abruptly, severing connections and retreating through collapsing coordinates. Back in the garage, he slammed the portal shut and leaned against the bench, exhausted in a way no battle had ever made him. Morty found him there later, sitting on the floor amid scattered tools, staring at nothing. Rick waved him off, but the gesture lacked force. Morty stayed anyway, settling nearby, presence quiet and insistent. Rick did not look at him, but he did not leave either. For the first time in a long while, Rick allowed the possibility that being the smartest did not have to mean being alone. The thought terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Rick avoided the garage for 3 days. It was an uncharacteristic decision, which made it feel strategic rather than evasive, at least to him. He busied himself elsewhere, disappearing for hours at a time into dimensions that required minimal engagement and even less thought. Supply runs, repairs on outposts he barely remembered building, tasks that involved motion without introspection. The kind of work that kept his hands occupied, while his mind circled the same unresolved problem, like a predator unwilling to strike. The house noticed his absence from the garage, even if no one said it out loud. Morty felt it most acutely. Rick's physical presence still came and went, but the gravitational pull of his projects had shifted. The garage had always been the source of escalation, the place where minor discomfort turned into multiversal emergencies. Now it sat dormant, its silence louder than any explosion. Morty found himself lingering near it anyway, drawn by habit and unease. He stood outside the door more than once, hand hovering near the handle, then pulling back as if touching it might trigger something irreversible. His dreams grew more vivid, less abstract. They no longer featured monsters or collapsing worlds, but choices, branching paths that demanded decisions he did not feel equipped to make. He woke up tired in a way sleep did not fix. Beth watched Rick with a clinician's eye, even when she pretended not to. She noticed how he paced the living room late at night instead of isolating himself among machines. How his insults became more automatic, less targeted, like reflexes firing without intent. She recognized dissociation when she saw it. She also recognized fear. Though Rick had spent decades disguising it as contempt, Jerry interpreted the change as progress. He took credit for the calmer atmosphere, attributing it to improved family dynamics and his own steady presence. He suggested game nights. He talked about therapy. He smiled more often, unaware that his optimism functioned as background noise to everyone else. On the fourth night, Rick returned to the garage. He sealed the door behind him and stood still for a long moment, letting the familiar smells and sounds reassert themselves. Oil, ozone, metal. The hum of standby systems waiting to be acknowledged. It felt like returning to a battlefield after an uneasy truce, uncertain whether the ground was still safe to stand on. He activated the lights and pulled the framework data back into view. This time, he did not run simulations. He did not try to break it. He studied it the way one studies an opposing philosophy rather than a machine, tracing not just how it worked, but why it had been built that way. The assumptions embedded in its architecture were alien to him. That intelligence should diffuse rather than concentrate. That systems should expect cooperation rather than betrayal. That resilience came not from dominance, but from adaptability shared across many imperfect contributors. Rick hated how coherent it was. He began mapping points of incompatibility between the framework and his own understanding of the multiverse. Places where his experience contradicted its premises. He cataloged wars started by cooperation that failed under pressure. Civilizations that collapsed because trust was exploited. Networks that had mistaken consensus for strength and paid the price. The data did not refute him. It absorbed those failures, contextualized them, adjusted. It treated them not as proof of futility, but as variables to be accounted for. Rick felt the urge to introduce himself to the system more forcefully, to leave a mark it could not ignore. The urge to be recognized as exceptional burned hot and familiar. He resisted it with effort that surprised him. Instead, he altered the framework, not to improve it, not to weaponize it. He modified it to fit inside the constraints of the Central Finite Curve, reshaping its reach so it would not destabilize the multiverse or threaten existing balances of power. He told himself this was a necessary compromise, a way to study the system without inviting catastrophe. He did not examine the quieter motivation beneath that justification, the desire to make it small enough to control. The result was a shadow of the original, still functional, still elegant, but diminished. Rick stared at it, dissatisfied. The system responded as designed, adapting to its new limitations without complaint. That acceptance irritated him more than resistance ever had. He shut it down and turned away, grabbing a flask he had stashed behind a gravity coil. The alcohol burned on the way down, grounding him in a familiar sensation. He welcomed the dulling effect, the narrowing of focus. Complexity was easier to manage when reduced to pain and noise. The next day, the consequences of his brief exposure to the network made themselves known. It began subtly, with anomalies Rick could not immediately trace. Portal travel felt marginally less precise, coordinates drifting by fractions that should have been insignificant but accumulated over time. Devices reliant on probability manipulation produced inconsistent results. Rick compensated automatically, recalibrating without conscious thought, but the adjustments grew more frequent. He isolated the cause within hours. The network had not followed him. It had not attacked or intruded. It had simply adjusted its own calculations to account for his existence. Rick had become part of its model. The realization unsettled him more than any direct threat could have. He had built his life around resisting categorization, refusing to be predicted or contained. Now, a system beyond his control had quietly integrated him without permission or confrontation. It did not seek to understand him individually. It treated him as one data point among many. Rick reacted the only way he knew how. He tried to remove himself. He constructed a series of dampening fields designed to obscure his signature across probabilistic dimensions. He scrambled residual traces left by his passage beyond the curve, severing links and collapsing pathways. The work was meticulous, time-consuming, and increasingly frantic. Each layer of obfuscation reduced the anomalies, but never eliminated them entirely. The network adapted again, not aggressively, not invasively. It adjusted its margins, accounting for uncertainty where Rick's data had gone dark. The model remained functional without him. That fact landed harder than any failure. The system did not need him to persist. Rick dismantled the dampeners in frustration, scattering components across the garage floor. The clangor echoed through the house, drawing Morty to the doorway once more. Morty did not enter. He watched from a distance, recognizing the signs of a spiral he had seen too many times before. Rick caught sight of him and froze mid-motion. For a brief, unguarded moment, Rick considered explaining, not in words, not directly, but through demonstration. He imagined opening the projection, letting Morty see the framework, the network, the proof that intelligence could exist without cruelty or hierarchy. He imagined Morty understanding it instinctively, the way he often did, and feeling relief rather than threat. The thought made Rick recoil. Morty represented everything the network embodied without trying. Empathy, cooperation, the capacity to function without needing to dominate. Rick had spent years dragging him through hell to prove that those traits were liabilities. The possibility that they were strengths instead felt like an accusation. Rick waved Morty away with a sharp gesture and returned to his work, slamming drawers and activating systems with unnecessary force. Morty retreated slowly, confusion and concern tangling in his chest. He did not understand what Rick was fighting, only that it was not something he could shoot or outsmart. Beth confronted Rick that evening, her patience worn thin by patterns she recognized too well. She did not demand explanations. She demanded accountability. Rick deflected, minimized, redirected. The exchange ended without resolution, tension settling back into familiar grooves. That night, Rick left again. This time, he did not go beyond the curve. He traveled laterally, moving through familiar universes, observing how his presence altered them. He watched civilizations react to his arrival, noted shifts in behavior, power structures realigning around him whether he intended it or not. He saw the same pattern repeat endlessly. Brilliance drawing attention, attention breeding dependence, dependence curdling into resentment. The network's philosophy echoed in his mind unbidden. Systems that revolved around singular nodes were fragile. Rick had always known this. He had simply refused to apply it to himself. He returned home before dawn, exhausted in a way that felt new. The garage greeted him with patient silence. He sat at the workbench and stared at the dormant projection, hands resting uselessly in his lap. For the first time since building the Central Finite Curve, Rick entertained a forbidden thought without immediately killing it. What if the curve was not a defense, but a prison of his own design? What if being the smartest had never been the goal, but the excuse? The thought did not bring clarity or peace. It brought grief. Grief for possibilities he had cut off deliberately, for versions of himself he had walled out because they threatened his narrative. Grief for the ease with which the universe had moved on without him when offered the chance. Rick shut down the remaining systems and left the garage lights off. He sat there in the dark, listening to the house breathe around him, aware that whatever came next would not be solvable with a weapon or a punchline. Somewhere beyond the curve, the network continued to grow, indifferent to his turmoil. It did not wait for him to catch up. It did not slow down. It simply existed, a quiet rebuttal to everything Rick had built. And for the first time in his life, Rick Sanchez did not know whether he intended to destroy it, join it, or finally walk away from the need to be at the center of anything at all. Rick woke up on the living room couch with his neck twisted at an angle that suggested either self-punishment or a failure to care which positions caused pain. The television was still on, cycling through infomercials from a universe that sold solutions to problems Rick considered unsalvageable. He stared at the screen for a while, without absorbing any of it, letting the noise serve its usual purpose of drowning out thought. The house was quiet in the particular way that meant everyone had already left. School, work, routine continuing without him. Rick sat up slowly, joints protesting, and became aware of the unfamiliar sensation that the universe had not collapsed overnight, despite his lack of supervision. That realization carried more weight than it should have. He stood, stretched, and immediately regretted it. His flask was empty, which annoyed him until he remembered finishing it sometime before losing consciousness. He did not replace it. That omission felt deliberate, though he refused to unpack why. The garage remained dark. Rick lingered in the doorway longer than necessary, hand resting on the frame, as if the threshold itself required negotiation. The space beyond felt different now. Not hostile, but expectant. He had always treated the garage as an extension of himself, a place where his identity manifested physically through machines and chaos. Now it felt like a witness. He turned away. Instead, Rick left the house on foot, something he rarely did. No portals, no vehicles, just gravity and pavement, and the mild discomfort of being limited to one universe for a few minutes. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, aggressively ordinary, lawns trimmed, cars parked with quiet obedience, lives constrained by scale. Rick walked without destination, letting his thoughts drift, despite his efforts to corral them. The network lingered at the edge of his awareness, not as data or code, but as implication, It had not contacted him again. It did not need to. Its existence alone had destabilized something foundational. He had spent his life solving problems by isolating them, breaking them down until they fit inside his head. The network defied that approach. It was too large, too distributed. There was no single point of failure to exploit, no core to dominate. It functioned precisely because it did not privilege individuals like him. Rick found himself wondering how many universes had existed beyond the curve that he had never seen. How many versions of reality he had excluded, not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. The curve had always been framed as protection, a way to ensure stability. But stability for whom? He stopped walking without realizing it, standing at the edge of a small park where children played on equipment that had never been tested against cosmic catastrophe. Their laughter was unremarkable and therefore unsettling. Rick felt the familiar instinct to retreat, to reassert distance through irony or superiority. Instead, he stayed where he was, observing without interference. It occurred to him, uncomfortably, that the network would not categorize this moment as significant. Back at the house, Beth noticed his absence with less alarm than usual. The tension of the past weeks had shifted into something quieter, less explosive but more persistent. She recognized it as a phase Rick entered rarely, when his chaos turned inward. She preferred explosions. Explosions could be managed. Morty noticed too. He had learned to track Rick's patterns instinctively, mapping mood shifts and danger levels without conscious effort. Rick being physically present but functionally withdrawn unsettled him more than outright disappearance. It suggested a kind of problem that could not be solved by surviving long enough. Rick returned hours later with nothing to show for his absence except fatigue. He went straight to the garage this time, sealing it behind him with a decisiveness that felt final rather than avoidant. He powered systems up slowly, one by one, letting the space come alive around him. He did not pull up the framework immediately. Instead, he accessed old files. Projects abandoned mid-construction, weapons never deployed, safeguards designed for threats that had since become irrelevant. He reviewed them with a detached eye, cataloging patterns. Over and over, the same structure emerged. Rick at the center, solutions radiating outward, dependencies forming whether he intended them to or not. Even when he tried to build something that could function without him, his presence warped it. He optimized too aggressively, removed friction that might have forced adaptation. His creations worked because he was there to make them work. The network had not made that mistake. Rick finally brought the framework back online, but this time he limited its scope to observation only. No interaction, no signal. He watched how it processed data, how it responded to incomplete information. It did not rush to fill gaps with assumptions. It left space where certainty was unavailable. Rick hated that restraint. He had built his reputation on never leaving gaps. Hours passed. The house darkened outside the garage windows. Rick remained focused, the usual itch for distraction dulled by something like reluctant respect. The framework was not smarter than him in any traditional sense. It did not outperform him in raw computation or theoretical abstraction. Its advantage lay elsewhere. It was comfortable not knowing everything. That realization unsettled Rick more than any challenge to his intelligence. Ignorance had always been an enemy to be crushed, a flaw to be eliminated. The idea that not knowing could be a feature rather than a failure ran counter to everything he had built his identity on. A warning chimed softly, pulling him from his thoughts. A localized anomaly had formed near the edge of the curve, minor but persistent. Rick traced it quickly, expecting familiar patterns. Instead, he found interference consistent with the network's operational signature. Rick stiffened. The network was not breaching the curve. It was not attacking or probing. It was compensating. Somewhere beyond Rick's engineered boundary, realities were shifting in ways the curve had not accounted for. The network was adjusting its models accordingly, not to bypass the curve, but to understand it. Rick had always treated the curve as absolute. Seeing it rendered as just another variable felt like an insult. He considered reinforcing it, strengthening the barriers, reasserting control. The tools were already there. He could do it in hours. He could make the curve tighter, more exclusionary, ensure that nothing like the network could ever threaten his curated infinity again. The thought brought no satisfaction. Rick realized, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that strengthening the curve would not solve the problem. It would only delay it. Systems like the network did not rely on force. They adapted, they waited, they persisted. He shut the warning down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, Rick considered the possibility that his greatest achievement might not be something he built, but something he dismantled. The idea was immediately followed by resistance. The curve was not just infrastructure, it was history, trauma codified into mathematics, a monument to loss and survival and rage. Dismantling it would mean revisiting reasons he had long buried under layers of cynicism and alcohol. Rick laughed softly at the absurdity of it all. The universe was infinite, and somehow he had managed to trap himself inside one idea. Footsteps approached the garage door, hesitant but determined. Morty knocked once, then waited. Rick did not respond immediately. He considered ignoring it, retreating into work the way he always did. Instead, he deactivated the isolation protocols and let the door open. Morty stepped inside, cautiously, eyes scanning the space for signs of imminent disaster. He relaxed slightly when he saw Rick upright and relatively intact. The relief was brief, replaced by confusion at the absence of visible chaos. Rick gestured vaguely at the workbench, an invitation without explanation. Morty approached, drawn by curiosity and the unspoken gravity of the moment. He did not understand what he was looking at, but he sensed its importance. The framework's projection was abstract, patterns unfolding and reforming in ways that felt almost organic. Rick watched Morty watch it. He noticed how Morty did not immediately try to categorize or judge what he saw. He observed, absorbed, accepted uncertainty without flinching. Rick felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with age or hangovers. Morty asked questions in his usual halting way, not with words Rick could hide behind, but with expressions that demanded acknowledgement. Rick answered indirectly, as he always did, but this time he did not lie. He omitted details. He deflected, but he did not distort. The framework continued to run, indifferent to their presence. Beth appeared at the doorway, drawn by the unusual quiet. She took in the scene slowly, recognizing that something had shifted, even if she could not name it. Rick did not look at her, but he did not shut anything down either. That alone felt significant. Jerry stayed away, sensing correctly that this was not a space where his involvement would help. The moment passed without resolution. Morty eventually left, reassured but unsettled. Beth lingered a moment longer, then followed. Rick was alone again. But the solitude felt different now, less absolute. He returned his attention to the framework, to the quiet confidence of a system that did not need to dominate to exist. Rick did not make any decisions that night. He did not dismantle the curve or reinforce it. He did not reach out to the network or shut it out entirely. For once, he allowed himself to exist in uncertainty. The universe did not reward him for it. It did not punish him either. It simply continued, vast and indifferent, full of possibilities he had once tried to control. Rick sat in the garage until the early hours of morning, watching a future unfold that did not require him to be its architect. And for the first time, that thought did not feel like failure. The next few days passed without incident, which unsettled Rick more than any immediate crisis could have. The framework remained active in a limited observational state, its patterns unfolding and stabilizing without demanding intervention. The Central Finite Curve held, neither strengthened nor weakened, existing in a tense equilibrium that mirrored Rick's own mental state. Nothing forced his hand, and the absence of pressure made every option feel heavier. Rick filled the time with maintenance tasks he had postponed for years. He recalibrated portal guns stored in a sealed cabinet, repaired drones he no longer used, and archived data from expeditions whose conclusions he had never bothered to draw. The work was methodical, almost meditative, and entirely unnecessary. Each task served the same purpose: delay. Morty noticed the change even if he could not articulate it. Rick was still volatile, still sharp, but the edge had dulled in a way that suggested restraint rather than exhaustion. He snapped less often. When he did, it felt automatic, like muscle memory firing without emotional investment. Morty found that more unsettling than cruelty, driven by intent. At school, Morty struggled to focus. The lessons felt thin, like shadows of relevance cast by a much larger truth he was not equipped to explain to anyone else. He caught himself thinking about the framework, about the way it shifted without collapsing, and wondered why it felt familiar. He had spent years adapting to chaos, learning to survive environments that changed faster than he could understand. The idea of a system built around that kind of resilience made an uncomfortable kind of sense. Beth remained watchful. She had learned not to trust calm where Rick was concerned. But this was not the brittle calm that preceded disaster. It was quieter, heavier, like something settling rather than coiling. She recognized the signs of grief in retrospect, the way it did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived disguised as reflection. Jerry continued to misread the situation entirely. He interpreted the lack of catastrophe as validation of his long-held belief that things worked out eventually if one simply waited long enough. He suggested family dinners. He proposed vacations. He spoke about the future in a tone that assumed continuity was guaranteed. No one corrected him. Rick's first real test came unexpectedly. The anomaly near the edge of the curve intensified, no longer content to remain a background fluctuation. Rick detected it while running diagnostics on a shield generator, the alert cutting through his focus with deliberate insistence. He froze, hands hovering over the console, then pulled the data up slowly. The anomaly was not random. It followed a trajectory, weak but consistent, pressing against the boundary of the curve without attempting to breach it. Rick recognized the pattern immediately. It was exploratory, not aggressive. A probe designed to gather information without provoking defense mechanisms. The network was learning. Rick's first instinct was to shut it down, to flood the region with interference and erase the anomaly entirely. The tools were already available, the calculations trivial by his standards. He hesitated, fingers poised above the controls, and forced himself to examine the impulse rather than act on it. Destroying the probe would not send a message of strength. It would confirm a weakness. Systems like the network adapted best to force. They learned fastest from resistance. Ignoring it might be safer. Engaging with it directly would be riskier still. Rick did nothing. He isolated the region, monitored the anomaly, and allowed it to persist within controlled parameters. The curve adjusted automatically, compensating for the pressure without destabilizing. Rick watched the interaction unfold with reluctant fascination. The network did not push harder. It adjusted its model, revised its assumptions, and shifted its focus elsewhere. It accepted the boundary. Rick leaned back, unsettled. He had built the curve to be absolute, a line that could not be crossed without consequence. Seeing it treated as a negotiable constraint rather than an obstacle challenged something fundamental. The network was not interested in conquest. It was interested in coexistence. That night, Rick dreamed. This alone was unusual. He rarely allowed himself to sleep deeply enough for dreams to surface, preferring intoxication or exhaustion to rest that might invite memory. The dream did not present itself as a narrative. There were no clear images, no dialogue, just impressions layered over one another, fragments of sensations stitched together without chronology. He saw himself building the curve, not in anger or desperation, but in quiet determination. He felt the certainty that had driven him then, the conviction that narrowing infinity was an act of mercy rather than control. He saw the versions of himself he had excluded, not as threats, but as possibilities he had chosen not to explore. He woke with a headache and no desire to analyze it. The next day, Rick did something that surprised even him. He opened a secure channel and left it open, broadcasting a narrow band signal designed to be detectable only by systems operating on the network's principles. The signal carried no data beyond its own existence. It did not announce intent or invite response. It simply acknowledged presence. He justified it as a diagnostic measure, a way to observe the network's reaction under controlled conditions. The lie was thin, but it held long enough for him to proceed. The response came hours later. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight shift in background radiation that Rick would have ignored under normal circumstances. The framework flagged it immediately, identifying it as recognition rather than reply. The network adjusted its models again, incorporating the signal without centering it. Rick felt an unexpected rush of irritation followed by something dangerously close to relief. The network did not escalate. It did not demand engagement. It acknowledged Rick's existence and moved on. The universe did not revolve around him. That realization landed differently this time. It did not feel like erasure. It felt like release. Rick shut the channel down and sat in silence, listening to the systems hum around him. He thought about Morty, about the way the kid navigated uncertainty without needing to dominate it. He thought about Beth, about the distance she maintained, not out of indifference, but survival. He thought about the versions of himself he had never allowed to exist because they threatened the story he told himself about strength. He poured a drink and let it sit untouched. When Morty came into the garage later that evening, Rick did not wave him away. He did not explain what he was doing or why it mattered. He simply let Morty be there, observing, absorbing. The framework continued its quiet operation, patterns shifting in ways Morty did not understand but did not fear. Morty asked fewer questions this time. He sensed that some things were still forming, not ready to be defined. Rick appreciated that more than he would ever say. The anomaly near the curve stabilized, then dissipated entirely. The network turned its attention elsewhere, satisfied with the data it had gathered. Rick watched it go with a mixture of relief and disappointment. Days turned into a week. The garage became a place of work again, but the work had changed. Rick no longer built toward dominance or defense exclusively. He experimented with redundancy, with systems designed to fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. He caught himself leaving inefficiencies in place, allowing room for adaptation rather than optimization. The change was subtle, but it was there. Beth noticed first. Rick's projects no longer left scorch marks on the walls. The house felt less like a staging area for disaster, and more like a place where disaster occasionally passed through. It was a small difference, but one she clung to cautiously. Jerry noticed too, though he misunderstood it. He assumed Rick was finally mellowing with age. He congratulated himself silently for enduring long enough to see it happen. Rick did not correct him. Late one night, alone in the garage once more, Rick pulled up a visualization of the Central Finite Curve. He stared at it for a long time, tracing its contours, remembering the certainty with which he had drawn those lines. The curve had protected him. It had also limited him. He did not dismantle it. Instead, he introduced a variable, a narrow margin of uncertainty, barely detectable, woven into the mathematics that defined the boundary. It did not weaken the curve or open it to exploitation. It allowed for adjustment, for negotiation, a reminder that no system, no matter how carefully constructed, should be immutable. Rick saved the changes and leaned back, exhaustion settling into his bones. He felt no triumph, no sense of victory, just a quiet acceptance that something had shifted and could not be shifted back. Somewhere beyond the curve, the network continued to expand, indifferent to Rick's internal reckoning. It did not celebrate his concession or mourn his restraint. It simply existed, adapting as it always had. Rick shut down the lights and left the garage, the framework still running quietly behind him. He did not know what this path would lead to, whether it would end in reconciliation or collapse. He only knew that for the first time since building his prison of infinity, he had left a door unlocked on purpose. The universe, vast and unconcerned, waited to see what he would do next.